We are approaching the end of the war. We hope. My mother-in-law is at this point a Navy nurse. She'd been in high school when the Pearl Harbor attack happened. My father-in-law is a Navy officer who's going to command a landing craft, both set to take part in the invasion of Japan. The Japanese had followed a policy of if you kill enough Americans, they'll go away, since the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal. And each battle that marched closer to the, you gotta be careful, that marched closer to Japan's home islands was increasingly bloody. We go from the Japanese having the best carrier aircraft in the world, absolute finesse in the operation of naval air power, to the wall of will and flesh that were the kamikaze. And what this meant was that the estimate of 1 million dead in the invasion of the southernmost and central Japanese home islands was very well considered. It was not an exaggeration. Since those interviews took place, we have more information from the Japanese archives that we didn't have in 1974. And we also have information from the Soviet KGB archives, which weren't released until the end of the Cold War. And more of our top secret archives were released. The Japanese Army slogan, 1 million people die gloriously together, was something that was fully intended to be realized. And had it been realized, Admiral Halsey's wrathful prediction that when he's done with the Japanese, the only place that the Japanese language will be spoken will be in hell, would have literally come true. The Japanese prince who was talking about it being an unnecessary attack because there were peace negotiations going on is absolutely right in that there was a group of civilians within the civilian side of the Japanese government that were involved in trying to get the Russians to broker peace. However, he neglects two rather important matters. First, the Soviets, being opportunists, had every intention of declaring war against the Japanese in order to expand communism into Asia. Stalin had promised at Yalta, a conference between the leaders of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, held near the Crimea in South Russia, today Ukraine, that within 6 months of the surrender of Germany, the Soviet Union will attack Japan, will join the war. The Soviets had been neutral in the war against Japan. And this would afford Stalin the opportunity to take Manchuria, Korea, to invade Hokkaido Island and northern Honshu, to move deeply into China, maybe as far south as Indochina. In other words, to do in Asia what he had done already in Eastern Europe, which is create a Soviet footprint behind which they can do what they want, because they have the army. There was no way on God's green earth that Joseph Stalin was going to pass up on this opportunity. So the negotiations with the Soviets were preordained to failure because it depended on Stalin's good graces as an honest broker, and the man was not an honest broker in this situation. Also, again and again, since the attack on Manchuria, it had been demonstrated that civilians had no power in Japan that the military did not allow them to have. The military knew about the plot. The military was perfectly confident that when the time came, they could control the plot stop it in its tracks, kill whoever they needed to kill in order to maintain their control of things. Within the Japanese military, the moderate elements had been overthrown, and the extreme elements, like the individuals who began the kamikaze corps, were in the ascendant. Understand that the worst traps and the worst prisons are the ones that we create with our minds. And as sentient human beings, our minds determine our reality in a way that is not true for animals. I gotta keep walking over you, little girl. We are our own. I'm tempted to use the word God, but I don't mean it that way. We are the arbiters of our own reality in a very literal way. Japanese society, as it was constituted, was in a trap because Japanese society was oriented to serve and protect the God Emperor. That's why Japan existed. And as such, the Emperor had been persuaded by the military authorities in 1941 that with the attack, or should I say, with the oil embargo that had been levied against Japan as a result of their occupation, please pass this back, of Indochina, that Japan had two choices. Give in to the American demands and let the oil flow, but humiliate the emperor. Have him lose face. Have him lose his reputation to some significant degree. Or fight. The emperor was persuaded by the military and by his own instincts to choose to fight. So, war was unleashed with sneak attacks, and the rest is history. With that decision, Japan is painted into a corner. Japan had never lost a war. Never. It was not part of their psychology. It was not part of their history. The Japanese people, from the time of the arrival of the legendary Emperor Jimmu Tenno, had ruled Japan, and yes, there had been wars among Japanese, but that's not the same as having the civilization of Japan coming onto the heel of another power. And in fact, during the Meiji times, you will recall just how hard the Japanese were willing to work, just how much they were willing to change about themselves in order to achieve strength in modern ways. Now they're losing. They're losing a war that many of them suspected they would lose if they couldn't produce a psychological moment where the American will to fight would be broken. That moment did not come at Pearl Harbor, and after Midway, that moment was not going to come unless it was a result of grinding casualties, of forcing the Americans to become the murderers of an entire nation of people. That's really what was behind the psychology of the Army. There were Japanese who understood the Americans enough to understand that what it would do to us, what it would do to our soldiers, would have changed us forever. To have pursued a war into every corner of Japan, knowing that the civil population would die killing Americans. An America that had done that would be like a young person who serves in the military who ends up taking part in torturing a prisoner. I personally believe that in war, torture is sometimes necessary. In this, I am a war criminal waiting to happen. But I don't believe it should be done by our troops. It should be done by the CIA or our allies, because that's their business. They are spies. They are involved in that dark world. To take a 19-year-old American volunteer, who basically is a person with great sentimentality and a person with great sense of good and righteousness, and make them carve on a person until they scream and talk, is to destroy their soul. The destruction of Japan would have cost the United States its soul. That's at least the gamble that the Japanese army was willing to make. Their end game was us letting go of their throat and allowing the God Emperor to remain alive and to some extent in power. It was always about him. By all means, inform yourself from adults. Do your research for your own sake. Get a sense of whether you happen to agree with the thesis I am laying out or not. Because there are certainly adults who disagree. They think that there is no excuse for the unleashing of atomic weaponry. Many of the same people think there's no excuse for the firebombing of Dresden or Tokyo. There was a bookstore owner in this city a few years ago. He no longer runs that business, who I was trading in books with. And one of my books was about Churchill, and he called Churchill a war criminal. As you may have noticed, Churchill is one of my heroes, and I argued the point. And the center of his conclusion was that Churchill had signed off on the firebombing of Dresden. That was enough for him to damn Churchill to hell forevermore. So there are people who hold us to a standard in peace and war that is different from the way they hold our enemies. That's not a reasonable argument. That's an argument rooted in faith. And I respect it as an argument rooted in faith. But as a matter of policy, the Japanese were not inclined to surrender, not the army, and I will prove it. Tokyo is firebombed. This is before the atomic bombings. More people are killed in that attack than any other bombing attack in World War II, including Dresden, including Hiroshima, and including Nagasaki. The Japanese army and the emperor fight on. They fight on because the USS Bunker Hill and the USS Franklin, both fleet carriers, are burned by kamikazes. The USS Enterprise, which has been involved in the war since day one, has its front elevator exploded. There's an amazing photograph. Tomizai, that's the name of the kamikaze, flew his plane into the opening into the elevator that carried airplanes from the hangar deck to the flight deck in the front of the ship. This massive piece of steel that was the elevator flew hundreds of feet in the air and is caught in midair after the attack by a photograph. So the kamikaze are working at the Americans. Finding a solution to them is a top priority because what we have now isn't working. In fact, the kamikaze attacks are becoming more intense. And when the landings in Japan occur, Japan is huge. Japan is much larger than the British Isles. More and more of this death cult will have a chance to fulfill its destiny. So, when faced with the success of the first atomic bomb explosion in New Mexico at Alamogordo, the Trinity bomb, the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, one of the most middle-class men to ever occupy the office. Truman is here with the glasses. I'm proud to have him on my wall, despite the fact that he was a liberal Democrat. because I deeply respect what he did at the beginning of the Cold War. And I think he was an honest man. I have no trouble disagreeing with an honest man. It's funny to say that about a machine politician, Democrat, but it's true. I do. Truman was offered the possibility of inviting the Japanese and the Russians and everyone else to a demonstration on an offshore island near Japan, where we would drop the atom bomb to demonstrate its power in hopes of intimidating the Japanese to surrender. But Truman believed that the Soviets would see weakness in this, and that the Japanese also would see weakness in this. The Japanese would learn the characteristics of the weapon, and so when it hit, there would be no shock and awe. They would expect it. They'd understand it. They'd be able to put it into a box and keep going. And the Soviets would conclude that we in the West are too lily-livered to use weaponry in war for real, despite our willingness to firebomb Tokyo and Dresden. The Soviets would see weakness in our choice not to use it on people. This is at least what Truman concludes. Remember, there are cities that are spared from regular attacks to be test grounds for new techniques and new weapons. Dresden was such a city in Germany. Hiroshima was the Japanese Annapolis. It's where their naval academy is. And we had never heavily bombed it. In part, so that when we were ready to test this new weapon, we had a fairly blank canvas to paint on. The bomb group that Colonel Tibbets was a part of had been training for months in a particular mission to drop a super heavy bomb. Their planes were altered to do this job, and the crew of all the planes in the unit were adapted to the special needs of an atomic weapon. They were based at Tinian, an island near Saipan. And early one August morning, Tibbets's B-29, with an escort and a photoplane, arrive in the airspace over Hiroshima. They're at 32,000 feet. Divide that by 5,500, you get how many miles up that is. The B-29 was the most advanced bombing aircraft in the world. It had a pressurized cabin, it had computerized gun turrets, mechanical computers, but still computers. And so it was so high, the Japanese fighters really couldn't reach it. And it dropped a single bomb. That bomb was about 15 kilotons. That's 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent explosive. If a Hiroshima bomb were dropped on the Coeur d'Alene Resort, the crater would extend to Interstate 90. The blast effects would extend out to the Albertsons in Hayden and Walmart. The radiation, depending upon which way the wind was blowing, and we didn't understand fallout or radiation yet. That came later. But the radiation would go hundreds of miles in whatever direction the wind happened to be going. If you were looking directly at the blast, you could be blinded either permanently or temporarily. And if you're near enough to the blast, your body will be vaporized. The wall behind you will suffer the flash effects of the brightness of the bomb, and there'll be a shadow of you in your last moments, like the shadow of that child jumping rope. That's called a Hiroshima shadow. They're rather ghoulish, but they are available if you wish to see them. The only equivalent that I can think of is at the foot of Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii and Herculaneum. You have the Romans who were buried by the ash, the dog at its chain, biting at its chain, trying to get free, the people who were just buried suddenly by the volcanic ash, and then their bodies rotted away, and there's this open hole. And Italian workmen discovered these human-shaped holes when they were doing work in the late 1800s, and so they filled them with plaster and then dug around the plaster, and you have these human beings in the last moments of their life. But at Pompeii and Herculaneum, this happened over a few minutes of time. At Hiroshima, it was the speed of light. The Japanese military said that it was a firebombing attack just like Tokyo. They called the reports of a single bomber and a single bomb Allied propaganda. They fought on. The emperor agreed the war would continue. That alone should tell you something. One atom bomb was not enough. A few days later, the B-29 bomber named Boxcar takes off and wends its way towards the only Christian city in Japan, Nagasaki, on the island of Kyushu. Nagasaki is not majority Christian, but it was the place where the Portuguese had their biggest base during the 1500s, and it was where the Dutch were allowed to come during the time of the Tokugawa shogunate when Japan was closed. Nagasaki also had been spared, and many of the people there believed it was because we didn't want to bomb fellow Christians. We dropped the second atom bomb there. This atom bomb was not a uranium bomb made of natural materials, it was a plutonium bomb made of more man-made materials. But both bombs operate on the principle of nuclear fission, splitting large complex atoms like uranium and plutonium, which is a man-made element, by the way. And when you split an atom, you release so much energy you can destroy the heart of a city. The Nagasaki bomb is about the same blast effect as the Hiroshima bomb. People in prison camps on the mainland of China saw the flash from the Nagasaki bomb hundreds of miles away. The emperor convenes his Supreme Council of War. Where he makes clear his intent to surrender. Most of the members of the cabinet are shocked. The emperor records a surrender message onto a vinyl record for broadcast the next day on NHK Radio, Japan's national radio service. And this will be the first time that the Japanese people will actually hear the voice of their God Emperor. The night between the emperor's recording and decision and the broadcast the next day, a group of young army officers, mid-ranking and lower, major and lower, maybe a few colonels, do the same thing that they did in Manchuria in 1931. They try to take history into their own hands. They believe that the emperor is in a moment of weakness and delusion, and they want to save him from humiliating himself and the Imperium. So they capture the headquarters of NHK Radio. They torture and kill the manager of the radio station. The manager refuses to give away the location of the emperor's recorded message. Other units around Tokyo begin to take up positions. It's a military coup in the name of the emperor against the emperor. What stops it is the last B-29 raid of the war, not an atomic bombing, more fire bombs, more explosive bombs, hitting Tokyo, breaking up the military plan. The next morning, the recording is produced and broadcast. In that recording, the emperor says these words: "We must endure the unendurable." If you understand the literal meaning of the word unendurable, you capture some of this. The God Emperor is commanding his people to endure something they never expected to have to endure, which is the loss of their freedom to a foreign power. the Americans were coming, and they will be greeted peacefully. They will be greeted with deference and even obedience. Japan will shift from an aggressive masculine stance to a passive feminine stance, at least for the time being. And so it is. But even with that, hundreds of Japanese officers commit seppuku, or harikiri, ritual suicide through disembowelment, rather than endure the disgrace. Up to the end, they desperately want 100 million, a nation of 100 million to die gloriously together, to preserve Geiko Kujo, the national essence, which is serving and defending the God Emperor. They cannot wrap their minds around the idea that the God Emperor has chosen the course of surrender. The United States had quietly but tacitly let it be known that we would not kill the Emperor, nor would we take him off the throne. That was never an official communication. It was unofficial, but it was communicated. And it was quite controversial, by the way, to grant this. But it's what allows the emperor to do this thing. So Americans begin landing in airports around airfields, rubble-filled, all around Japan. And Japanese army units place themselves at the disposal of the Americans. Emaciated prisoners who days before were under the threat of being beheaded because of anger over bombing raids are released. Again, these are like the victims in the Philippines and in Nazi Germany concentration camps. They're basically skeletons with thinly stretched flesh over them, people who are barely alive, people who can barely eat or drink, people who are barely conscious. To my mind, nothing in the history of Japan saved more Japanese lives than the atomic bombs. That sounds counterintuitive. I'm talking about the atom bombs, 2 fission bombs being used to save lives. This is my point. The Japanese people were in the hands of their military. The military was committed to a course of national suicide. Suicide in Japan and Japanese culture is different from anywhere else on earth. Even the Islamic terrorists who blow themselves up or fly planes into buildings have a sense that this violates the normal rules, but they are doing it as a sacrifice to Allah. But in Japan, there is this totality of commitment that exists in every way, which is why so many promising young students kill themselves when they don't get into the college they want. When businessmen suddenly realize that their decisions led to the destruction of their business, they kill themselves. There are forests where it's socially acceptable for Japanese to do this. The Japanese are not a Christian nation. They're not a monotheistic nation. At the heart, Japan is Shinto. And at the heart of Shinto is the nature of life in the presence of a living God. And in the presence of a living God, you and I and all other regular human beings are disposable. I am disposable. That's what the culture says. Shocking Japan out of that suicidal course took 2 atom bombs. And even then, a significantly strong faction within the army tried to stop it and came somewhat close to succeeding, because the Japanese people could not imagine surrendering. Now, VJ Day happens 15th August 1945. The Soviets have been engaged in the war for 2 weeks. In that time, they've taken Manchuria, Northern Korea, parts of China. They are beginning to fuel the Chinese Communist Party in its attempt to win a civil war against Chinese nationalists. The Chinese Communist Party largely sat out the war with Japan. There's a lot of modern Chinese military movies that show the CCP prominently fighting the Japanese. That is a lie. The communists sat out the war with Japan with a few notable exceptions in order to wait for the Japanese and the nationalists, the Kuomintang, to destroy themselves, whereupon the communists would come in and take over. And the Soviets are going to give them an opportunity to do this. The moral costs of victory are things that you should consider. First of all, total war. In this war in Europe and in the Pacific, it was as likely for a soldier at the front to get news that their family had been killed in a bombing raid or by being sunk up on board a ship as it was for a family back home to be told that their loved one had been killed in battle. All sides had bombed civilian targets. The modern notion of war crimes in the context of World War II is laughable, because push comes to shove, desperate human beings will do what desperate human beings need to do. The last time the United States won a clear victory in a major war, we were willing to use any weapon to win the battle, up to and including firebombs and atomic bombs. But we won. Since then, the American military has never unleashed its full power. I don't even mean its conventional power. In Korea, we restrained ourselves. In Vietnam, we ridiculously restrained ourselves. In the Gulf War, it was quick and relatively clean. In the wars on terror, we really did fight with one hand tied behind our back. And that does something to you. Though we didn't have to kill the entire Japanese nation, we came out of the war different than when we entered it. We were less innocent. Still, compared to most of the rest of the world, 1945 Americans were really golly gee whiz innocent, almost, choir boys. Another effect is what to do now that we are in the atomic age. Do we place atomic weapons and atomic power in international hands? That's what Truman wanted to do at first. I'm really glad that didn't happen. But he wanted to give the atomic secrets to the United Nations and let them control it, which is idealistic. But Stalin knew all about the atom bomb. At the Potsdam Conference, after the European War ended and before the Japanese War ended, Truman quietly took Stalin aside and said, "Hey, we have a new bomb. It can destroy a city." Stalin said, "That's nice." He wasn't moved because he knew more about it probably than Truman did. And 4 years later, in 1949, the Soviets developed their atom bomb. We then develop a hydrogen bomb. Hydrogen bomb is nuclear fusion, smashing two hydrogen atoms together. A hydrogen bomb, if dropped on the Coeur d'Alene Resort, would have the crater go out to beyond Walmart and Hayden. The blast effects would go beyond Rathdrum. The radiation effects would be much greater. Atom bombs can destroy civilization. Hydrogen bombs can destroy all life on Earth. The Soviets developed their hydrogen bomb within 3 years of us developing ours. We now have a world that is maintained by a balance of terror between two sides who have increasingly become capable of mutually assured destruction. But since the 1990s, the atomic secrets have slipped to people who never could have developed the weapons on their own. The North Korean, the Chinese get them from the Russians, the British and the French get them from us. That's in the 50s and 60s. The Israelis get their own because they have really good intelligence. That's also in the 60s. The Japanese have the ability to make atom bombs anytime they want. For obvious reasons, they've been reluctant to do that, but with China behaving the way it does today, I'm sure the Japanese are building a quiet but real atomic deterrent. North Korea gets the atom bomb in the 90s from the Chinese. North Korea gives the atom bomb to the Pakistanis. The Russians give their atom bomb to the Indians to balance that particular equation. The Iranians are getting their nuclear technology from the Pakistanis, and so on. The Libyans gave up their nuclear program as a result of our promise not to overthrow Gaddafi. Then we overthrew him. The South Africans gave up their atomic bomb when apartheid ended in the early 90s. But we still live in the shadow of the mushroom cloud. Mushrooms are tasty. Mushroom clouds, not so much. Einstein once says, I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will certainly be fought with sticks and stones. In other words, he predicted that if World War III was fought fully with atomic weapons, at the very least, human civilization would be gone, and we would be bombed literally back to the Stone Age. Also, there are tens of millions of what are called dispos. Dispos are displaced persons, people whose nations no longer exist or whose borders have moved hundreds of miles, or whose families are completely gone, wiped out in genocide or wiped out by battle. What to do with all of these people? The world has been taken like a sand sculpture or an ant farm and shaken, and everything is different. Tomorrow I plan to begin talking about the final solution, and there will be a test after I'm done with that, but that'll be a few lessons. Questions, thoughts, comments, ideas on any of this? Yes.
So in regards to Stalin, what was, do you know anything about his views when Hitler was defeated? Like if he took that as like a what not to do, or because they were both like...
Well, Stalin would have certainly received the remains of Hitler and used them as part of his toilet facilities. There's no question about that. Stalin was going to get Hitler. And the fact that Hitler killed himself, Stalin would have thought him a coward for doing that. Stalin was never going to allow that to happen to himself. Now, the modern connection is this. In the early 1990s, the Chinese Communist Party observes Gorbachev modernizing the Soviet Union and overseeing the fall of communism. And they determined never to let that happen to themselves. If you ever want to understand the motives of the Chinese Communist Party, it's to avoid doing what Gorbachev did, which led to the fall of the Soviet Union. These people would rather see the world burn so long as they can rule the ashes. That is their priority, to hold on to power at all costs. And it makes them rather brittle. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? Yes?
Didn't they develop some of the atomic bomb down in the Tri-Cities or something like that? I know that there was areas...
In Washington, there was the Hanford production facility, which helped produce fissile material for atomic weaponry and later for fusion bombs. So, yeah, Hanford was a big deal, and there's a reason why that area is off limits, because there's some radioactivity. Yeah?
Will you be touching on the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yes. I'm going to have to do post-war quickly, but I do intend to mention it and talk about it enough to have it make some sense.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Have a good day.
Oh, that was very disappointing.